that work in like the medical field, I got lost at the hospital trying to get the vaccine. And one of the nurses that found me looking lost, and she's like, let me take you up. And she was like, we're having a hectic day, so I could use the break. And I was like, oh, is it just more hectic than normal? She was like, oh no, it's actually normal. So I know how hectic you're all, like anybody that works in a hospital, how hectic it's been. I'm like, I have friends who are nurses, so I hear from them as well. Okay, let's get started then. Not really going to talk about happy things because we're talking about Nazi Germany, but at least it's something that I feel like most of you are pretty comfortable with Nazi Germany. Is that correct? So, so not everybody though. From the last time I asked, that's why I am going over some basics because I want us all to be on the same pace with that, same place when it comes to all right, our understanding of what's happening in Nazi Germany and the explanations that scholars have come up with. I do want to point out that on Tuesday, Katie was bringing up some of the connections to like modern day U.S. Trump administration stuff, and I didn't want to dismiss that. I just wanted to make sure and start off with, definitions of fascism are tricky. We do overuse that word a lot, and politicians use it to accuse other politicians of things in a lot of like they misuse the word a lot. And so, as a result, I feel like in modern day politics, the word ends up losing a lot of meaning. And it doesn't mean that we can't use it. It just means like, hey, let's pay attention and actually analyze those things when we hear that word being thrown around, because it actually, it actually has a much more limited definition when scholars get into debating what counts and doesn't count um, as fascism. So let me share my screen and go back to talking about some of the things we were talking about. So basically, yeah, a part of what we look at is that a lot of these Mussolini in Italy, he was using violence, right? Violence and mass demonstrations were a key part of his tactics getting into power. But when we look at Nazi Germany, we see that everything was done pretty legally. They were still using fear, right? A lot of fear mongering. And I think that is something that why a lot of people like making the comparison to Hitler. He's also become very kind of like Hitler becomes like our idea of everything, right? He seems to embody everything evil we can think of. And I mean, that reputation is justly earned in a lot of ways, but it's also an easy way to forget the small and big ways in which people end up contributing afterwards, right? One of the keys for me when analyzing Nazi Germany is understanding the way in which, the way in which health and race became intertwined in the language they were using, right? Um, it was very clear, right? Hitler's regime was very clear. They were trying to create a utopian society based on the principle of race, right? They wanted an Aryan only nation state, right? But the key in that was the health of the national community. And they use that phrasing a lot instead of talking about, you know, I mean, they were explicit with Aryanism, but a lot of times the way it started was not talking about, oh, only Aryans are good. No, it's talking about let's eliminate bad genes. Let's create a healthy community. Let's get rid of enemies. When you use that language, it becomes easier to accept, right? Even people that, a year beforehand would not have agreed to some of these things end up thinking, well, yeah, you're right. The health of the country is important. And it makes it easier to accept really outrageous things, right? So this is something that's really important, that a lot of that language was about health. Uh, and because the science of eugenics was already well established all over the world, right? This was not language that the Nazis invented. In fact, as most of you already know, thanks to more recent things that have the way we talk about fascism and Nazism in public, is that they were actually looking at California. California specifically, but also at the Jim Crow South, to look at how to implement racial eugenic policies. Right? We in California were actually at the forefront of eugenic science. Right? The science of eugenics, the most recent things at the time were being developed in Southern California. Right. So I know not everybody has heard about this, but I know plenty of you have heard about like the forced sterilization of Latina and Black women in California. So that happened, and that was not even, we're not talking about the 30s or the 40s. In the 60s and 70s, they were sterilizing immigrant women at the USC hospital. Right, it was a public health hospital. Women were coming in and they were being tricked into signing forms, oftentimes right after giving birth. They would put forms in front of her saying, consent forms saying that she agreed to be sterilized. And some of these women didn't speak English. The forms were in English, and they were being told they needed to sign the form. So women would sign the form. They would have their, what's commonly known as, get their tubes tied, which is a sterilization. And that was happening in the United States. Oh, yeah, I will get to that, Odalis. But I also want to point out that um, these eugenic policies were practiced in the South as well, where a lot of Black women say that they were sterilized without their consent. Some of these women didn't even find out that they were sterilized until someone came and told them. Someone been like, hey, we saw your name on this list. We're checking to see if you consented to this. And they'd be like, wait, that's why I can't have children? Some of these women didn't even know. The same thing happened at hospitals in reservations. So Native American reservations in the US, where they were, traditional ways of birthing and of pregnancy were being upended. And there was some of this sterilization practices also being done to Native women.
Professor,
Yeah.
um, I just wanted to add really quickly because I read an article not too long ago about how women of color, like specifically like Hispanic women who didn't have a lot of English background, were coerced into signing documents that basically signed their rights away and allowed doctors to give them hysterectomies and I forgot the term for it. What was it? Sterilized. So like they didn't even know that they were signing that permission for them to do that because they were not able to read in English, and when they did have translators, they weren't including that part of the document in that.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And this was happening in the U.S. and not, and recently, right? The way that's eugenic policies, and then, some of these doctors we've been able to interview since then, and they claim that they in their mind they were helping the state, the country, save money. That's and they don't see anything wrong with what they were doing. Even more recently, so there's two things that I know for sure are happening. One, in prisons. This has been happening in California prisons, even though there was a law against it. There are laws that prevent like sterilizations to occur in prison hospitals, because women do go to prison pregnant and then they give birth in prison. It turns out that in California, there were prisons that were also sterilizing women that were in prison, a lot of times forcing them to, now giving them the option to say no. The problem that a lot of activists have brought up in prisons is that your body belongs to the state while you're in prison, like everything, right? And so giving consent, even where they do have consent forms, is not possible when your body belongs to the state. And so in California, we recently passed another law that reinforces the fact that prisons cannot sterilize women while they're in prison. They just flat out can't because of the way it's been abused. And then the other thing, as people were bringing up in the chat, is immigration detention centers Were denying abortions, and were also there was where was that? It was in Georgia. It was a detention center in Georgia where a number of detained women came forward and they said that they had been forced to sign consent forms for a sterilization. The nurse that helped the doctor perform the sterilizations um, um, confirmed those reports. Yeah. Yeah, some of them would not even know because all the if the paperwork's in a different language, or so a lot of times it began with a health problem. A detained woman, a detained immigrant would have some sort of health issue. All of a sudden, she's rushed to the doctor, and then all of a sudden, all these things get brought up that had nothing to do with the initial issue. So yeah, so all of this, I'm like, we like to blame Hitler for all of it without realizing that this is happening even today, and that he didn't invent any of that parts, right? He's going to take it to the extreme. Hitler will. He is going to take. Very soon after they begin eugenic policies in Nazi Germany, they are performing the most sterilizations are happening in Germany. But before that, most of them were happening in Southern California, right? And it was racially motivated, right? This was about eliminating any uh, genetic non-Aryan traits. This is what it came down to, right? Um, and eugenics, right? It is a science. It's a scientific approach to like genetic engineering, right? A lot of it can. There are different. There's positive and negative eugenics, right? One way in which we see eugenics is with advertisement towards white women, telling them that they need to be mothers to have kids, right? And we see that in Nazi Germany, asking families, Aryan families, hey, have kids. The best way to be fulfilled as a person is by having children. And the negative eugenics is things like sterilization and preventing certain people from having kids, right? And it wasn't just, it was racial, right? So amongst the targeted groups were Jews, but also just any non-Aryan, but also targeting anybody with a disability. If you were born with a disability and you went to a doctor during the Nazi regime, they had to sterilize. They actually, for babies that were born with any kind of disability or deformity, they first started not sterilizing babies, but killing killing them. That did not go unnoticed, right? Sterilizations can go unnoticed to some extent, right? But killing babies would not go unnoticed. They actually did have to stop the practice a year into the program because people found out that they were doing this. Doctors were mandated to do it and without the parents' consent. And so there was an outrage, a backlash to killing the babies, and so they did have to stop that aspect of it. But they already had a lot of access to a lot of people that were in mental asylums were targeted for sterilization and euthanasia, so killing them. People in prisons, right? And if you're in prison or you're in a mental hospital, who do you complain to? You're complaining to the people that are doing this thing. So there's no check on those practices, right? And this is what I'm talking about here. So by 1937, right, 200,000 people had been sterilized in Germany. Right, the sterilizations were still happening in the U.S., about 3,000, but the Nazi regime really does take it to a different level. And then in 1939 was when they started these euthanasia campaigns against inmates, people in mental asylums, and children with any kind of disability or deformity. That was all seen as trying to eliminate those genes from the gene pool, right? That was the excuse that they were doing, but this was for the health of the nation. Right? So a couple of German words, I'm like, my German's not very good. But this was, all of this fit into these ideas of Gleichstellung. Wait, who can say the word in German? I know usually I have somebody in German say it and it's got a slightly different pronunciation. Gleichstellung. No, nobody took German? Oh, you guys are no help. Okay.
It looks like it's more like Gleichschaltung. That's what I think it looks like. I don't know.
No, it's Gleichstellung, but I'm using the wrong accent. I'm using a very American accent, but so maybe. But it means leveling and bringing into line. It means when you're part of the German nation, you don't stand out, right? The individual is not important. It's about being part of the whole, right? That's how the only way an individual matters is as part of the whole, right? And the idea was that everybody needed to be under the National Socialist system, the Nazi system, right? That was very appealing to a lot of working class people in Germany, but it wasn't just limited to working class people. A lot of wealthy aristocrats in Germany, especially families that were very nationalistic, did that. But bringing into line also meant, focusing on young people, right? So the Hitler youth groups were really important part of the programming. In fact, they had boarding schools where boys would, be sent off to the school, and they would have basically military training, some educational training as well. But the idea was that we are going to prepare them to be soldiers. A lot of it was modeled after their version of Sparta, but there was a lot of focus on youth. But also you see this idea of leveling and bringing into line in the mass parades, right? In the rallies, right? And those rallies and parades were really significant for people, right? It made people feel like they were part of something bigger than them. And if you've never been to a parade or a political rally, to me, I imagine it similar to like when you go to a concert. If you go to a concert where everybody knows the words to every song, and when the band begins playing, and all of a sudden the entire stadium is singing the exact same thing at the same time, and it just feels like really great. I imagine that's the similar feeling that people had who participated in these rallies and parades, right? That it was for people that had been feeling like things were not going well, they hated the government. This would have been an incredible experience of unity, right? Yeah, you get caught up in the collective, right? So it's not unique to political situations. I feel like you can understand it if you've ever been to a concert or been to an event like that where like the audience is all into something, right? Oh, Jeremiah, you just saw Triumph of the Will in class last night. Yes. So okay, Triumph of the Will is a really important film because it was made by one of the most innovative filmmakers of the time, Leni Riefenstahl. And Leni Riefenstahl revolutionized how you shoot these mass gatherings. Like she did beautiful shots of people, of the chanting, of the movement. She also did the Olympics were in Nazi Germany, and she revolutionized the way you shoot athletes, focusing on their bodies, doing just these beautiful shots of the divers, Olympia, yeah. And she's really interesting. I might have to bring in a clip. I have a video of her, the documentary made about her and her collaboration with the Nazi regime. Right. This is. So this is Leni Riefenstahl working on one of her films, and this is a shot from Triumph of the Will. I couldn't find a really good quality clip online, but I'm going to search out. I know those clips exist on YouTube, so I just need to find a good quality one.
Professor?
Yeah?
So, just really briefly, so what were the roles of women in Germany that she was able to, actually take that position? Because I can't really see a lot of women in the United States being able to take a position like that.
So the idea was women had to hold traditional roles, being mothers. They primarily wanted women pregnant and giving birth to Aryan babies, but there were exceptions for exceptional people. So Leni Riefenstahl was just a widely acclaimed filmmaker, right? And because the Nazi regime focused a lot on propaganda, right? They had an entire division, offices devoted just to propaganda. So they were able to hire her, and she was, invited to a lot of dinners and a lot of events of Nazi officials. After the end of World War II, Riefenstahl argued that she was forced to, that she couldn't say no. When I see those interviews, though, it's really hard to believe her. It's really hard to believe her. Nazi officials within the office, the propaganda office, wrote about her in their diaries. They talked about being friends with her. So a lot of the evidence, I think, shows that she wanted to be there, right? That she did not object to what she was doing, and she did her best work was for the Nazi regime, because Triumph of the Will and Olympia were both propaganda films meant to showcase Nazi Germany, right? Yeah, do I hear someone wants to add? Yeah, I'll come in and show you some of the documentary of what of her talking about it. She has since died, but she lived for a long time afterwards, completely disgraced because all of her best work, showcased the Nazi regime. But it's really extraordinary what you could get away with if you were talented and willing to accommodate and collaborate with the regime. The other thing about Germany is that there were very little objections, right? She, oh, I haven't seen Inglourious Basterds in a while. I need to see it again. If she inspired one of the characters, huh? Yeah, okay. I'm gonna have to rewatch that movie. But there was very little protest in Nazi Germany. There was only a handful of noteworthy protests in Nazi Germany during the Nazi regime. There was the oh, hold on, let me get the chat, see what you're doing. Debates or merit. Okay, they talk about that in the movie. Yeah. Because the question with people like her come up with, what is the moral obligation of artists, a talented artist in the middle of a regime like that? And can you say no? Should you say no? So there was very few protests. There was a couple of school children who wrote anti-Nazi leaflets. They were killed very quickly. There was one protest in Berlin when a few wealthy Jewish men that were married to Aryan German women were arrested. They protested it, and the protests got national attention, global attention, and the men were released. But other than a handful of individual limited cases, there was no mass protests to the Nazi regime in Germany at all. Right? That really stands out. You see them in other places, but not in Nazi Germany. By 1939, right, Jews were being targeted for exclusion. Right. So here, once we get to 1939, that's an important year. I don't emphasize a lot of years in my classes, but 1939 is important because it is when they decide that they will remove Jews from Germany. Right. It's not a coincidence that is the same year that the invasion of Poland begins. Right. Every time that there is an escalation in war, there's also a major step taking towards the final solution, towards the death camps. Right? They don't yet exist here, but in 1939 they do decide to remove people from Germany, right? So and put them in first in ghettos. But Jews were not the only group targeted, right? We know that the Romani were targeted as well. Anyone that was a political dissenter, if you spoke out against the regime, you would get arrested and sent to a camp. Black Germans were targeted, Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men. Gay men were targeted, and I will get to that in a second. And anybody that had any kind of physical or mental handicap. Once they end the euthanasia campaigns, then it's all right, we will remove them and then send them to the camps, right? It all begins though in 1933 with the economic boycott, right? That is the law saying that Jews could not patronize Aryan businesses, that Aryan people could not buy, they could not go to Jewish businesses, right? Yeah. When was it actually considered to start? So they're considering at this point in 1939, they're trying to decide what they're going to do. They know they want to remove Jews, but they're playing with different ideas. One of the ideas was to send the Jewish population of Europe to Madagascar. So basically to just remove them from Europe. And they are talking about potentially killing, but they don't have a good method of killing that many people at a large scale, right? They're still coming up with that. So I will get to that in today as well. But I want to talk about the targeting of gay men first, because this is a little bit less known, right? It was illegal in Nazi Germany. Once the Nazi regime comes to power, it was illegal to be a gay man. You could not be a gay man, right? It was criminalized. There was a law saying that it would be punished with prison, right? And a significant number of gay men were arrested. A significant number of gay men went to the concentration camps, to death camps. Instead of having to wear like the Star of David on their clothes, they wore this pink triangle on their clothes. Since then, in the 60s and 70s, the pink triangle was adopted by the gay rights movement, right? So it has positive connotations now, but at the time it was a way of identifying who the gay men were in the camps, right? But let me ask you, why do you think the law that made being gay illegal only targeted gay men? Why were they not targeting women as well? Because they were not. Lesbian women were targeted in different ways. They would close down the cabarets and some of the known hangouts for lesbian women, but it was not illegal. It was not against the law to be a lesbian. It was illegal to be a gay man. Olalis has the answer in the chat. It was all about reproduction. The idea was that a lesbian woman could still reproduce. Even if she has sex with other women, she can still be impregnated. Now, there was rape, but the idea was that, hey, they can still have babies, so that's not illegal. On the other hand, gay men were wasting their seed by having sex with other men, right? That sperm could be used to impregnate a woman, and by having sex with other men, they were wasting that. Those were potential citizens of Germany that were being wasted away. And that was kind of the rationale for making male homosexuality illegal and not female homosexuality. And so Katie, I see what you want to say? No, I was like, if you want to add, Katie, but the idea was that the number one goal for the Nazis was for people to have sex and to reproduce. At first, the Christian churches liked the Nazi regime because a lot of it was about tradition and going back to traditional roles. But very quickly, the Christian churches became very disillusioned with the Nazi regime because the Nazi regimes didn't care who you had sex with, right? Hey, you're having sex with a woman who's not your wife? Fine. Are you getting her pregnant? Because that's all we care about. That was like the push. The push was have sex, we don't care if you enjoy it or not, as long as you're, you know, not trying to prevent pregnancy.
Were they sent against their will to that one like palace place that they had like pure Aryan like men and pure Aryan women go to make pure Aryan babies?
Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean that rapes didn't occur, and if it was, and that they were over, you know, that nothing was done about them.
So it wasn't like a systematic, like you're a lesbian, so we're gonna rape you and force you to have a child because you're a lesbian?
No, not systematic. Not that it wasn't happening, but in the individual cases, but it was not a systematic part of the program. They thought it was enough to just encourage people to have sex at that point and to threaten and kill gay men. Yeah, and you know, a lot of this was not okay with the Christian churches in Germany. But by that point, by the time you get to 1939 and beyond, the churches are not doing it much to speak out. Right? Very notoriously, the Catholic Church knew what was going on in Germany and helped individual families, like people the Pope knew were helped to get out of Nazi Germany, but nothing else was done by the Catholic Church. That's a whole other topic, though, what the responsibility of some of these institutions were. But that is something that, yeah, if you're interested in, there's a lot of literature on the responsibility of the Catholic Church and what they did. So, okay, let's look at the sources that I had assigned for this week, because there's a couple of important things. Hopefully there's nothing too revolutionary in the sources. I do expect that most of you know at least elements of this, but we want to see how just obvious, like this was not something that was being hidden most of the time. The persecution of Jews was not hidden from the public. The world knew that. They didn't know about the death camps, or most of the world didn't know about the death camps. Whether or not other governments knew is a bit of a question mark, but people knew the other horrible things that were going on, right? And did essentially nothing, right? So I want to go to where is it? Here it is. To speech to SS officers in Posen. So this is Himmler. So note some of these names. It's not you. It's not a misspelling. You're not reading it wrong. It's Himmler. This is a speech being given to SS officers in German-occupied Poland, and he's very clear about what the message is. Right? Do I have any volunteers to read the first paragraph? There aren't any German words, so you don't have to know German.
Can I read, Dr. Gardner?
Yeah, read the first one.
The one that starts, I also want to talk?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I also want to talk to you quite frankly on a very grave matter. Among ourselves, it should be mentioned quite frankly, and yet we will never speak of it publicly. Just as we did not hesitate on June 30th, 1934 to do the duty we were bidden and stand comrades who have lapsed up against the wall and shoot them. So we have never spoken about it, and we will never speak of it. It was that tact, which is a matter of course, and which I am glad to say is inherent in us, that made us never discuss it among ourselves, never to speak of it. It appalled everyone, and yet everyone was certain that he would do it the next time if such orders are issued, and if it is necessary.
All right, so that he's just alluding to, like, hey, sometimes we have to kill our own. Like, we don't talk about it publicly, but we're all gonna do it. It's kind of oddly phrased, because also by addressing that in a speech, he's kind of he is talking about it publicly. So it's a weird thing to say, but yeah. Who would like to read the next one that starts, I mean the clearing out?
I'll knock it out.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I mean the clearing out of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish race, It is one of those things that's easy to talk about. The Jewish race is being exterminated, says one party member. That's quite clear. It's in our program. Elimination of the Jews, and we're doing it, exterminating them. And then they come, 80 million worthy Germans, and each one of them has his decent Jew. Of course, the others are vermin.
Yeah, he's gonna go on. We don't have to read all the horrible things he's gonna say, but this was openly talked about, right, amongst themselves within Germany, right? This idea about eliminating the Jews. This today I've chosen not to show you some of the image of the other propaganda, the Nazi newspapers, what they were printing. They were always depicting Jews as these kind of evil figures, sometimes as animals, a lot of times vermin, so rats. That was a common way of depicting it. Most of the time, they're also depicting male Jews as a threat to a female image of Germany. Right? This was quite common, and it was, they're not really going extremely out of their way to hide it. It's hidden from the rest of the world, but within their circles, this people knew what was happening, right? This first one, though, description of a mass execution of Jews in Ukraine from 1942. I don't want to read all of it because it's actually kind of hard to read. But did anybody that looked at it, can it give us a summary of what's being described in that document?
I think I could give a brief synopsis, Dr. Cardona. It was just like talking about how there was like a mass execution of these Jewish people were being, in a sense, being treated as animals. They were made to strip themselves from their clothing and then line up where a large grave was already dug, mostly by the Jewish people digging their own graves, and then and they were just waiting for the order to be executed. There was some powerful stuff in the end because they talked about how these Jewish people were just they didn't they were like resilient, right? They were just like oh, this is just what happens. They were like ignoring what was gonna happen. There's like one account where a grandma's playing with a baby and just like trying to comfort it before the end.
Before they kill. So the final solution, the decision about what to do with the Jews of Europe, was made in 1941. And it's 1942 technically, but they were talking about it beforehand, and the conference at which they make the decision is in 1942, shortly after, just months after the invasion of the Soviet Union. Right, the invasion of the Soviet Union is in 1941. And they make the decision around that shortly afterwards. So I think it's another mass escalation of the war, and then the implementation of the final solution. I think those things are related. Every time they escalate in war, they also make another major decision on what to do with the Jewish population. And at first, they still don't have the gas chambers, right? At first, they don't have the gas chambers. So how are you going to kill people? You shoot them. Right? And that's what they would do, what's described in the document. They would force Jewish families, Jewish communities in certain towns to dig ditches, to dig trenches. And then they would line up people. Usually they would do 2 rows in front of the ditches, in front of the trenches. They would shoot the people on the outer row. And with the idea is that you shoot those people, and they're going to push the people on the other row into the ditch. And therefore, you're going to kill everyone, but you're going to save bullets, because you can't individually shoot every person, because there's also a war going on, and you needed the bullets for the war. So you would basically shoot 1 row of people and suffocate the second row, like force the dead bodies to suffocate the rest of them in the ditch. it's horrific, right? It's horrific. And the other thing that stands out to me about that practice is that it just couldn't keep going on. They found out really quickly they couldn't keep using that strategy because it was traumatizing the men that were doing the shooting, right? It was traumatizing the men that were doing the shooting. They were finding that these men were experiencing PTSD, what we now call PTSD, after these mass shooting events, and that it made them unable to function afterwards. Like they couldn't do the things that they were getting assigned to do. As a result, they have to come up with a different way of killing people. Does anybody know a little bit of how they came up with the idea of the gas chambers?
It started off with trucks and truck exhaust. So they'd have people go into these trucks and stuff or whatever the back part of it, and then have the carbon monoxide suffocate them in the trucks. And
Yeah.
then it just wasn't enough people. So they had to come up with a more complex deal.
Yeah, so a lot of it actually was coming on the ground from, officers and people in charge noticing the trauma that soldiers were experiencing in the mass shootings and saying, well, we can't do that. We can't just, lose all of these soldiers. And so they actually came up with the idea for the gas on the ground. So this was not Hitler. It was not high Nazi officials in the regime. These were people on the ground who were actually doing the executions. Came up with, all right, we can't do it one-on-one the way we've been doing it. So a less direct way so that the soldiers don't get traumatized is using gas. And very quickly, like things like exhaust weren't super efficient, but all right, once they came idea with something like a gas chamber, then they had these like almost like gas chambers on wheels that they would roll around from site to site. Then gas had already been used within World War I. So they're like, wait a minute, they're the innovative people, creative people, start putting things together and just making it more efficient to execute. And so very quickly then after that, you get the death camps. Not every camp was a death camp. Some camps, like Auschwitz, for example, was a two-part camp. You had a section that was just meant for work, for people to work, right? Work them to death. It's not like they expected people to survive, right? But then there was the gas chamber part of it, and and if you end up at a death camp, you're meant to either work to death, or if you're not fit to work, to immediately go to the death camps, or to immediately go to it. So it's horrific. Every time I talk about them, every time I read about this, it's just as horrific to me as the last time. So part of the questions that comes up when we're looking at this is, who's responsible? Who do we hold responsible for the mass execution of people? Right? Past explanations. So one of the explanations that scholars looking back at it came up with was that it was all connected to the Nazi plan to achieve economic and demographic superiority. Right? That the final solution was part of Nazi expansion, so that it's the economic and demographic plans that are to blame, right? Other explanations was that it was Adolf Hitler himself that comes up with all of it. That is, he is the sole person responsible for it. Right? He had a history of anti-Semitism. Right? Although, yeah, he had probably Jewish blood in his line, but he had a lot of negative experience, and especially during World War I, ended up just ramping up the rhetoric about blame Jews. Other scholars talk more about the anti-Semitism that existed in Europe and had existed for decades and centuries beforehand. The anti-Semitism was not new either, right? You have centuries of it in Europe, to the point where a lot of people look at what was happening in Nazi Germany, the exclusion of Jews, of taking away their citizenship, all of those things, and people didn't necessarily bat an eye at it. Right? a mass number of people didn't demonstrate, did not look at it as, they might think it's wrong, but they're like, man, it happens, because there's a history of it happening in all over Europe already, right? What are the problems with some of these explanations, would you say? Or do you find them satisfactory, or one explanation more satisfactory than the other?
I think also, Dr. Carter, it erases uh, the notion of like maybe other nations, because I think I've heard one time how other scholars have argued about how maybe the Versailles Treaty played an impact on this whole ordeal, because like Germany was depressed, and then it allowed the rise of like, the charlatan to like, um uh, prophesize on let's make Germany great again.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jeremiah, what you're saying in the chat, some of these are just too simplistic, right? If you just have one of these things, you probably don't get the Holocaust, right? One of these things is probably not enough. You need a lot of these different elements. Like, you needed the historical anti-Semitism to be there. Now, you needed a leader willing to do these things, but you also needed everyday people to do it, right? Later on, I'll talk about the people that lived in towns and villages near the death camps. When the soldiers got there, the American and the Soviet soldiers were the ones who liberated the death camps. They could smell burning flesh, right? And some of these towns and villages were downhill from the death camps. There's no way they didn't know what was happening in there, but at the moment of liberation, they all claimed they didn't know. Most people in Germany claimed they didn't know. And so part of it was what allowed people to feel like they didn't really know what was going on was the way that the Germans compartmentalized everything, right? No one person was responsible for at every stage. You had the SS that were rounding up people from their homes, but then you had, what about the train conductors, the people putting people into the trains? Right. Well, the person working at the train station sees it and sees that these trains are packed full of people in horrible situations, but they're thinking, well, I don't know where they're going. Right. And is able to just say, well, I didn't know. Even though if you are looking, the connections are clear. Right. People, it allows people to just say, like, no, I just did this one thing. I didn't do it. I was not responsible for everything else. Right. That becomes important at the end of the war, when it comes time to create international law about human rights, and then holding people responsible. How do you hold people responsible when everybody in Nazi Germany collaborated in some form or another? Right. It becomes, so then you have to pick, and so we pick organizations and individuals that we know there's no dispute, right, about their contribution. We'll get to that as well. I already talked about anti-Semitism. I want to skip some of this anti-Semitism stuff. Another question that people also bring up is, why didn't they leave? Jews in Germany, Jews in Eastern Europe, right, in Poland, in the Ukraine, as they see the Nazis coming, why don't they leave? Right. Some of you know the answer. What are some of the reasons why people didn't leave?
They weren't being let in to other countries. There was one example where there was a whole big ass boat of Jewish refugees, and they came to America, and they were left in the port, and then they decided they weren't going to let them in, so they sent them back to Germany.
That with the boat is really extraordinary. The fact that they even managed to leave Europe to begin with, and there was a boat full of Jewish refugees coming. They asked the United States to be allowed in, and the U.S. said no. And each and every single one of person in that boat eventually ends up in a camp. Some countries like had decided to take in, but nobody wanted to take in the entire boat. So like Britain was like, well, we'll take some of them, or we'll take maybe some, and then it was horrific. Yeah.
I mean, recently they found Otto Frank's application for asylum.
Really,
so-
I hadn't heard.
Yeah.
That. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fairly recent. They were going through all the files and they found the paperwork for him to try and get his family out,
Wow. Wow.
and he wasn't approved.
Yeah, they were just not there was one, it was hard to leave Germany. At first, it was easier, but very quickly in like 1933, they make it hard to leave Germany. If you wanted to leave Germany, you basically had to pay a fortune to the German government. And some people were able to leave then, but if you didn't have the money, there was no way to leave. And then after that, you just couldn't legally. You couldn't once they, especially after 1939, you couldn't leave Germany. So any people that left Germany tended to have left earlier, late 20s, early 30s, kind of that era, that timeline. But there were, Jews within the people within the Jewish community urging to leave. Men, we have found out, were less likely to want to leave Germany. A lot of Jewish middle class and upper middle class people own businesses. Right? The men owned businesses, and their identities were tied to being business owners. And a lot of them expressed feeling like they couldn't just leave everything they had worked for in Germany. Most Jews in Germany considered themselves German first, Jewish second. They identified primarily as German. They had already been integrated into Germany beforehand. In the 19th century, a lot of the laws that had prevented Jews from, like being citizens and having certain jobs and all of that had already been eliminated. And so Jews in Germany were very, very well integrated. So they didn't want to leave their country. We know from a lot of the memoirs and a lot of what survivors have talked about that women in Jewish families were more likely to want to leave and to try to push to leave. But it was also difficult for families to leave as a whole, right? You want to leave with your family. You don't want to leave anyone behind. And if you were a woman and if you're taking care of your parents, for example, you're not going to leave without your parents. You don't have the money to leave with everybody. It was easier for single men to leave, right? Because especially if you're a young unmarried man, you don't have a lot of responsibilities holding you back. Right? You don't have people to take care of necessarily. And so men were more likely to leave. Married men were also more likely to leave. Sometimes families would create arrangements where, all right, you leave first, right? Husband leaves first, and then we will follow afterwards. Several problems with that, right? One, it becomes much harder afterwards for anyone to leave. Yeah.
Did they have so they didn't see, because Jews, that's a religion.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
But this wasn't this didn't have any religious like
No.
it was all they actually felt like that was a whole nother race.
They viewed it as a race because there were a lot of Jews in Germany who were not practicing Jews. They didn't go to synagogue. They didn't practice any of the religious rituals. Like, they were not religious, and it didn't matter. In the eyes of the German law, they were Jewish.
I see.
Yeah. So it was, we still kind of do that. We see it as a race rather than a religion, right?
Yeah, like US and Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so even, people some Jewish families have not been practicing the religion for generations. It didn't matter, right? And so that's where like the the laws become very specific, deciding how much blood in your ancestry you can have. How many ancestors do you need to not count as Jewish? And so they got very specific. If you had a grandparent, you were Jewish. There's a little bit more removed, then maybe you could not be classified as Jewish, but you had to prove that you had an Aryan ancestry. Yeah. Yeah. So most men left. Oh, so the other problem with the men leaving is, where are they going to? If they're going to places like Britain or the US, they have better shot. But a lot of men in Nazi Germany, a lot of Jewish men, were leaving to places like France. In France, every time I read that in a book and I'm like, oh, I'm reading a work of fiction outside in the Holocaust, I'm like, oh, he's going to France. No, that's the worst place to end up, because eventually that will be Nazi controlled territory. France will be controlled. And actually, I'll get to that once we get to France. Most Jews in France don't survive. A small percentage of Jews in France survive. The numbers are abysmal. The only place with worse survival rates is Germany. Well, Germany and Poland probably. But the other thing for a lot of Jewish, the Jewish councils, very notoriously during this time, actually helped organize some of the ghettos. And part of that, what went into that decision, was that it wasn't clear how much time the Nazis would be in power. A lot of people felt like this is temporary. In like the next election, or it might be just a few years, and then they'll be out of power and we'll be back to normal. This calculation, but because anti-Semitism was so normal in Europe, a lot of families had experienced waves of anti-Semitism, right? Or their grandparents had, or their parents had, and the family has survived that. So there was no reason not to expect to not survive this. Right? People thought, well, it'll be difficult for a number of years, but we'll survive it, like we have every single other wave of persecution. So, that's why, like, even in the ghettos, a lot of people still thought that we just have to write this out. Okay. There was resistance organized in the ghettos once it became clear that they're not letting anyone out alive, and that when they start deporting people to the death camps and to the work camps, and nobody's coming back, and a few people, there were people that managed to escape the death camps and the work camps, and so there were rumors about the gas chambers. But it felt like something so like ridiculous that it was easy to convince yourself that that's just some crazy rumor. It was pretty easy to convince yourself. Right? There was a lot of very famous people that very prominently left Germany, right? Albert Einstein, for example, very prominently left, but he and his family left early in Germany. And he described what was happening in Germany as the psychic illness of the masses. But that him leaving was a big deal, right? Because it's what allows the U.S. to build the bomb. And so all of that science and intellectual property, a lot of that intellectual power ends up in the U.S. or in Britain. Those were the two places where a lot of intellectuals in Germany went to and survived. All right. I'm trying not to end in something super horrific, but the other thing that I want to emphasize is, so I've kind of already talked about some of this, the faces, right? That it does not all begin with the gas chambers. And that's important to know. I think that part of the importance of that is because people have to go along with it at every different stage, right? if there had been a mass demonstration or just a mass movement to stop some of this earlier on, then you never get to the to the to the deaths. But people went along each step, and so each step becomes important to understanding how we get to the death. Most Jews that died during the Holocaust died in 1942 and 1943, because it's when they were like, it was an assembly line of killing people at the gas chambers. And yeah, Katie had put this in the chat that it was in January 1942 at the Wannsee Conference that the final solution was decided. And again, for me, it's I think there's a correlation with every time they increase the war, right? The invasion of Poland was horrific tactics. But it's at that point in 1939 when the ghettos begin, and most of the ghettos were located in Poland. Right? In 1941, they begin the invasion of the Soviet Union, and that war was a war of annihilation. The Soviet Union, the Soviets were seen as racially inferior. So there was no reason to really be nice to the Soviet population. And so that was a war of like, we're going to kill every Soviet person, civilian, soldier, officer. They didn't even care if a soldier surrendered. The idea was you kill them. Right? And so it's after that we see the mass execution of people at the camps. All right. I will stop here. We'll stop here before we get some of it. But I think that is part of the emphasis, why this is important to understand. Part of it is if part of the goal is to learn something from history, then we have to understand it as complex. Right? That doesn't mean making excuses for anybody or anything like that, right? It just means, all right, let's understand how people collaborated at each of these steps, and that each of the steps is required to get to the end. People don't come up with a final solution. If somebody comes, starts giving speeches about final solutions, we know, hey, bad, right? Our radar's up, we're listening. But if somebody's talking about health and nationalism, our radar's not necessarily paying attention, because that's much more common, right? And so a lot of breaking down of these steps becomes important, and if we're trying to learn something about it, about genocide. And the one thing about the Holocaust is because it's been so studied that it's possible to break things down like this. Other genocides, because they have not been studied as well, it's a little bit harder to do the same kind of steps. But this one can give us a model with which we can look at other genocides. Right. Katie's talking about the movie Conspiracy. Okay, I'm jotting that one down because I don't think I've heard of that one. I'm like, I usually watch all of this. I'm like, I watched Inglourious Basterds. I missed the Leni Riefenstahl reference, so I'm gonna have to go back and watch it. I actually usually use Inglourious Basterds to talk about Jewish resistance. That movie, well, if you know Quentin Tarantino, Quentin Tarantino likes to make very violent movies. And that one and Django Unchained are sold as like revenge fantasies. I think those movies are actually more historically accurate than we give them credit for, right? I think the fantasy element's not there. People fought back, right? People, when they saw that this was happening, people went to the hills, right? They knew the location much better than the Germans, so they hid. That was a difficult decision to make, to join any kind of resistance, to try to arm people, especially because once you're in the ghettos, you don't have weapons. Right? But even in the ghettos, people organized resistance. In the camps, they organized resistance. Right? Like people did fight back. That's not a fantasy. People fought back. But there was also a lot of reasons why a lot of people collaborated. So So, okay, what we'll do next week is we'll talk about France, because what I find is that most people don't know what's happening in France during this time. What happens in France is horrific, and allows us to delve a little bit deeper into why some people collaborated, why some people resisted, and how we can decide who's doing what, right? But we'll get to that later on. The movie that we will see in week 9, it's all about that collaboration. We're also going to talk about gender. So I think I'll start this on Tuesday, is we'll talk about, did your gender matter and what kind of experience you're having in the Holocaust? So you can all have an immediate response, but I want you to keep your mind open to what I will argue next week. But Cairo?
Will we also talk about like when everything ended, like with the whole Nazi regime, how Germany recovered and how people who were, originally part of it, like how you were saying the photographer,
Yeah.
and how he was basically blacklisted from all of society. Are we gonna talk about those people as well?
Yes, we will. So I'll use particular people as examples, but we'll talk, for example, about the Nuremberg trials and the UN and the development of this idea of human rights, how that gets implemented in UN. Yeah. So we will talk about, and we will definitely talk about like what the Allies do with an occupied Germany to deal with it once they find out. Whoops. What? I wanted to refresh this to show you what you have to do today. It looks like it doesn't want to let me do it. Let me try doing this. But yes, we will definitely talk about that. We'll even talk about the liberation of the camps and what you do with people who are extremely malnourished, about to die, and how did American and Soviet soldiers deal with finding out about the camps for the very first time by going into them, right? And how we also create memory about it, right? How we remember why we study the Holocaust more than any other genocide, especially in the U.S. I do want to get into that. There's some I think there's some complex racial elements there as well. Okay, this is taking forever to load. All right, we'll stop. It must be my internet. So for this week, what you have to do is the George Grosz reading response. So if you were not in class on Monday, you probably want to go back and look at that recording or the one on Wednesday from the week before, because your classmates helped you with a lot of that. The answers are basically in those two recordings. And the main thing, I mean, you could just base it on your reading of George Grosz, but I highly recommend looking and seeing what the interpretations that you all brought up. All of that was wonderful, what you all brought up in class. So I can't wait to read those. And in the meantime, I'm gonna be grading your true crime papers. My goal is to finish them this weekend. I know most of you haven't gotten the grades for them yet because I've been busy trying to get a COVID vaccine, but you will get your grades this weekend. Everybody will get a comment. And then on Monday, I can tell you how to find your comments if you don't find them right away. Sound good? All right, then you're all free to go watch something like cute or a cartoon or a fun song.
Or listen to Baby Shark.
There we go. You know what? I need to start bringing some fun videos.
Thank you, Dr. Cardona.
To insert amongst all the genocide. Bye.
Always look on the bright side of life.
I love that's exactly. I like to play like even just music at the end.
I have
To
a
bring it
question.
in.
The paper due on Sunday?
It's due Sunday. Yeah, the George Grosz one. So it's only 1 or 2 pages, or 1.5 to 2 pages.
Do we number the answers, or you want like an essay form?
You can number the answers. I do want full sentences
Okay.
and paragraphs, but you can number them.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
You too. And you don't have to worry about the George Grosz, Katie. You and I talked. So just remember what we talked about.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Roberto, do you have a question?
Thank you, though.
No. All right. Bye.
Bye.